It was 2:30 in the morning when Debra Manning heard the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The soft creak of her bedroom door opening. She lived alone in a quiet suburb of Sacramento. The doors were locked. The windows were secure. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. But there he was, a figure in the darkness, wearing a ski mask, holding a flashlight that cut through the black like a blade. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't scream. I'll kill you if you scream." What happened next would become part of the most terrifying crime spree in American history, a reign of terror that lasted over a decade. 50 home invasions, 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and for 40 years nobody knew who he was. Tonight we're going to walk through every detail of the Golden State Killer case, from his first attack in 1976 to his capture in 2018. We'll examine the evidence, the victims, the investigation, and the man behind the mask. This is the story of Joseph James DeAngelo, the suburban family man who lived a double life as one of America's most prolific serial killers. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you who chose to spend your time with us here on Crime Vault. Your support means everything to us, and it's what allows us to bring you these detailed investigations week after week. If you haven't yet subscribed to Crime Vault, I'd like to gently ask you to hit that subscribe button. It's one of the biggest ways you can show us love and encourage us to continue doing what we do best, bringing you comprehensive true crime stories with the respect and detail they deserve. Your subscription goes a long way in helping us grow this community of people who believe these stories matter. Now let's get back to the case that terrorized California for over a decade. Sacramento, California, June 18, 1976. The ransacker, as he would first be known, didn't start with murder. He started with something that seemed almost ordinary. Rancho Cordova was a growing suburb filled with young families and new homes. Safe neighborhoods where people left their doors unlocked and children played outside until dark. It was the kind of place where the worst crime might be a stolen bicycle or graffiti on a fence. But that night, everything changed. The first victim was a single woman in her 20s. She woke to find a man standing over her bed, shining a flashlight directly into her eyes. He was wearing a ski mask and dark clothing. In his hand was a knife. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said in a whisper that barely qualified as a voice. "I just want money and food. Do what I say and you won't get hurt." But it wasn't about money. It was never about money. Over the next hour, he would tie her up with shoelaces he'd brought with him. He would ransack her home, taking small items, coins, jewelry, photographs, and then he would assault her. When it was over, he disappeared into the night as quietly as he had come. The victim called police immediately. The responding officers found evidence of forced entry through a sliding glass door. They collected fingerprints, photographed the scene, and filed their report. At the time, it seemed like an isolated incident, a random break-in by an opportunistic criminal. But 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same neighborhood, same method of entry, same whispered voice, same ski mask. Then again, and again. By the end of 1976, there had been over 20 similar attacks in the Sacramento area. The police began to see a pattern emerging. This wasn't random. This was organized, methodical, the work of someone who was learning, adapting, perfecting his technique with each attack. Detective Richard Shelby was one of the first investigators to recognize what they were dealing with. In later interviews, he would describe the perpetrator as unlike anything we'd seen before. "Most burglars want to get in and out as quickly as possible," Shelby explained. "This guy was different. He was taking his time. He was studying these homes, learning the routines of the people inside. He knew when they went to work, when they came home, when they were most vulnerable." The attacks followed a distinct pattern. The perpetrator would target single women or couples in suburban neighborhoods. He would case the homes for days or even weeks before striking, often prowling through backyards and peering through windows. He preferred homes with sliding glass doors or easily accessible windows. He would cut phone lines before entering. He would bring his own ligatures, shoelaces, rope, or strips of cloth to bind his victims. Once inside, he would wake his victims with a flashlight to the face and the whispered threat, "I'll kill you if you move. I'll kill you if you scream." But what made him truly terrifying wasn't just the attacks themselves. It was the psychological torture that accompanied them. He would spend hours in the homes of his victims. He would eat their food, drink their beverages, rifle through their personal belongings. He would force them to lie face down while he placed dishes on their backs, threatening to kill them if they heard the dishes fall. During one attack, he spent over 3 hours in a victim's home. He made himself a sandwich. He watched television. He called someone on the phone, though the victim couldn't hear what was said. It was like he was playing house, one victim later told investigators. Like he was pretending this was his home and we were just objects. The psychological impact on the victims was devastating. Many moved away from the area entirely. Others installed elaborate security systems and never felt safe in their own homes again. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how ordinary he seemed. Witnesses who caught glimpses of him described an average-looking white male somewhere between 5'8" and 6 feet tall, with a medium build. Nothing about his appearance stood out. He could have been anyone's neighbor, co-worker, or friend. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. By 1977, the attacks were becoming more frequent and more violent. What had started as burglaries with sexual assault was evolving into something far more sinister. The perpetrator was getting bolder. He was targeting couples now, not just single women, and his methods were becoming increasingly sophisticated. On February 16, 1977, he struck a couple in Carmichael. The husband was a large man, over 6 feet tall and well-built. But size didn't matter. The intruder had already figured out how to neutralize any advantage his victims might have. He would enter the home while the couple was sleeping and wake them with a flashlight and a gun pointed at their heads. He would separate them immediately, tying up the male victim first, usually in a back bedroom, before returning to assault the female victim. He had it down to a science. Detective Larry Crompton would later write in his book about the case. Every move was calculated. Every word was planned. He knew exactly what he was going to do before he ever entered that home. But it was during this period that investigators began to notice something else. The perpetrator wasn't just committing these crimes randomly. He was calling his victims. The phone calls started a few weeks after the Carmichael attack. Victims would receive calls at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes the caller would hang up immediately. Sometimes he would whisper threats. Sometimes he would just breathe into the phone. "I'm going to kill you," he told one victim. "You can't hide from me. I know where you work. I know where you live. I'm going to kill you." The calls served multiple purposes. They allowed him to continue terrorizing his victims long after the attacks were over. They helped him gauge police response times when victims called 911, and they gave him information about his victims' schedules and routines. But the calls also revealed something about his psychology. This wasn't just about sexual gratification or material gain. This was about power, control, the ability to reach into someone's life whenever he wanted and remind them that they were never truly safe. As 1977 progressed, the attacks became more violent. He began using more sophisticated restraints. He started bringing multiple weapons, and he began making threats that went beyond the immediate attack. "I'll kill you and your family if you call the police," he would tell victims. "I know where your children go to school. I know where your husband works. I can get to any of you whenever I want." During one particularly brutal attack in October 1977, he spent over 4 hours in the victim's home. He moved freely between rooms, eating food from their refrigerator and watching television between assaults. At one point, he left the house entirely, only to return an hour later and continue the attack. "It was like a cat playing with mice," one detective observed. He wasn't in a hurry. He was enjoying himself. The investigation was expanding rapidly. Multiple law enforcement agencies were now involved, sharing information and resources. Composite sketches were created based on witness descriptions. A task force was formed to coordinate the investigation, but the perpetrator seemed to stay one step ahead at every turn.
He would change his appearance between attacks.
Sometimes witnesses described him as clean-shaven, other times with a mustache or beard. Sometimes he appeared thin, other times more muscular. It was as if he was deliberately altering his appearance to confuse investigators. He also seemed to have an uncanny ability to avoid detection. On several occasions, police arrived at crime scenes within minutes of the attacks, only to find no trace of the perpetrator. He would vanish into the night as if he had never been there at all. By the end of 1977, there had been over 40 attacks in the Sacramento area. The perpetrator had earned a new nickname, the East Area Rapist. But he wasn't finished evolving. In December 1977, the attacks began spreading beyond Sacramento. He struck in Stockton, then Modesto, then other communities throughout Northern California. His territory was expanding, and with it, the scope of his crimes. The media began covering the story more extensively. Newspapers published warnings about the East Area Rapist. Television stations ran segments about home security. Community meetings were held to discuss safety precautions. But the publicity seemed to have an unexpected effect. Rather than deterring the perpetrator, it seemed to energize him. The attacks became more frequent, more brazen, and for the first time they began to include elements that suggested he was reading about his own crimes and incorporating details from the media coverage into his attacks. During one attack in early 1978, he told a victim, "I saw you on TV. You looked good talking about me." He was watching, he was listening, and he was learning from every mistake the investigation made. The East Area Rapist had become more than just a serial offender. He had become a student of his own crimes, constantly adapting and improving his methods based on what he learned from law enforcement's response. And soon, he would take the next step in his evolution. October 1979, Goleta, California. For nearly 2 years, the East Area Rapist had terrorized Northern California. Then, suddenly, the attacks stopped. Sacramento breathed a collective sigh of relief. Maybe he had moved away. Maybe he had been arrested for another crime. Maybe he was dead, but he wasn't gone. He was evolving. On October 1st, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend Alexandra Manning were found shot to death in Dr. Offerman's condominium in Goleta, near Santa Barbara. The crime scene was unlike anything local investigators had seen before. The sliding glass door had been pried open. Phone lines had been cut. The victims had been bound with ligatures before being shot. Personal items had been stolen. But the most valuable things in the home, expensive jewelry, cash, electronics, had been left behind. It looked like a burglary gone wrong. Detective Larry Poole told reporters at the time, but something about it didn't feel right. What didn't feel right was that the crime bore all the hallmarks of the East Area Rapist attacks. But with one crucial difference, these victims were dead. The East Area Rapist had killed before. There had been one murder during a home invasion in Sacramento in 1978. But this felt different, more deliberate, more final. 3 months later, it happened again. December 30th, 1979, Charlene and Lyman Smith, a young married couple, were found beaten and shot to death in their Ventura home. Same method of entry, same type of ligatures, same pattern of behavior. But this time, investigators found something else. A call had been made to the Ventura County Sheriff's Department. The night before the bodies were discovered. "You're never going to catch me," the caller had whispered. "I'm going to kill 2 more people tonight." The voice was familiar to investigators who had worked the East Area Rapist case. The same whispered tone, the same controlled cadence, the same chilling calm. The East Area Rapist had moved south, and he had started killing. Over the next several years, the attacks continued throughout Southern California. The perpetrator now had a new name, the original Night Stalker. But to investigators who had been tracking his crimes from the beginning, he was the same person. The methods were identical. The psychological profile was consistent. Only the outcome had changed. The Southern California attacks were more violent than those in the North. The perpetrator seemed more confident, more willing to take risks. He would spend even longer periods in victims' homes. He would take more personal items, and increasingly, he would kill. Keith and Patrice Harrington, newlyweds, were found beaten to death in their Laguna Niguel home in August 1980. Manuela Whittoon was raped and beaten to death in her Irvine home in February 1981. Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were shot and beaten to death in Goleta in July 1981. Each attack bore the same signature elements: cut phone lines, pried doors or windows, ligatures, personal items stolen, and now, almost invariably, death. But the killer was also making mistakes. During the attack on Keith and Patrice Harrington, a neighbor heard what sounded like arguing coming from the victim's home around 3:00 a.m. The neighbor considered calling police, but decided against it, assuming it was just a domestic dispute. If that call had been made, it might have been the break investigators needed. During another attack, the perpetrator dropped a roast from the victim's refrigerator while moving through the house. The roast rolled under a bush outside the home, where it was discovered days later by investigators. DNA evidence was recovered from saliva on the roast, evidence that would prove crucial decades later. The perpetrator was also becoming more talkative during attacks. Victims who survived reported longer conversations, more personal revelations, more glimpses into his psychology. "You ruined my life," he told one victim. "Now I'm going to ruin yours." To another, "I hate you. I hate all of you. You don't deserve to live." The statement suggested someone struggling with deep-seated anger and resentment. Someone who blamed others for his problems, someone who saw his victims not as individuals but as representatives of whatever had gone wrong in his life. Psychological profilers began developing a more detailed picture of the perpetrator. He was likely a white male in his 20s or 30s. He probably lived or worked in the areas where he committed crimes. He had access to detailed information about his victims' routines, suggesting he might work in a service industry, construction, utilities, telecommunications. He was organized and methodical, indicating above-average intelligence, but he was also impulsive and prone to rage, suggesting underlying psychological issues. This is someone who feels powerless in his daily life. Dr. Donald Lundy, a forensic psychiatrist, told investigators, "The attacks are his way of asserting control, of proving to himself that he has power over others." But despite the expanding profile and increasing resources devoted to the investigation, the perpetrator continued to evade capture. He seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. Multiple witnesses had seen him fleeing crime scenes, but he always managed to disappear before police arrived, even when response times were less than 5 minutes. On one occasion, a police officer actually encountered the perpetrator during an attack. The officer was patrolling a neighborhood in Rancho Cordova when he noticed a man walking along a bike path behind a row of homes. The man was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be carrying something in his hands. When the officer called out to him, the man dropped what he was carrying and ran into a nearby field. The officer gave chase but lost him in the darkness. What the man had dropped were burglary tools and ligatures. The attack that was likely being planned never took place, but the perpetrator had once again escaped capture. By 1982, the original Night Stalker had committed at least 10 murders and dozens of rapes across California. The investigation was one of the largest in state history, involving multiple agencies and hundreds of investigators. But then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. The last confirmed original Night Stalker attack occurred in May 1986. Janelle Cruz, an 18-year-old student, was beaten and raped in her family's Irvine home while her parents were out of town. She died from her injuries. After that, nothing. No more attacks. No more phone calls. No more sightings. The original Night Stalker had vanished. For more than 20 years, the case went cold. Investigators retired. Files were transferred to storage. The task forces were disbanded. The original Night Stalker became a footnote in California criminal history, a reminder of how even the most extensive investigations could fail. But the case never truly died. Michelle McNamara was a writer and true crime enthusiast who became obsessed with the case in the mid-2000s. She spent countless hours poring over police reports, crime scene photographs, and witness statements. She created detailed timelines, maps, and victim profiles. McNamara was convinced that advances in DNA technology and database analysis could finally identify the perpetrator. She worked closely with investigators, sharing her research and advocating for renewed attention to the case. In 2013, she published an article in Los Angeles magazine titled, "In the Footsteps of a Killer." The article brought new attention to the case and introduced a new name for the perpetrator, the Golden State Killer. "He's not the East Area Rapist or the original Night Stalker," McNamara wrote. "He's one person who terrorized the entire state of California for over a decade. He's the Golden State Killer." The name stuck, and with it came renewed interest in solving the case. McNamara continued her research until her death in 2016. Her posthumously published book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, became a bestseller and brought even more attention to the case. But McNamara wasn't the only one keeping the case alive. Detective Paul Holes of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office had been working on the case since the 1990s. Holes was convinced that DNA evidence would eventually lead to the perpetrator's identification. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Holes worked to have evidence from Golden State Killer crime scenes retested using increasingly sophisticated DNA analysis techniques. Each test revealed more detail about the perpetrator's genetic profile. By 2017, investigators had developed a comprehensive DNA profile of the Golden State Killer. But the profile didn't match anyone in the FBI's CODIS database or any other law enforcement database. That's when Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer decided to try something that had never been done before in a criminal investigation: genetic genealogy. Working with genealogist Barbara Ray Benner, they uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database used by people researching their family histories. The database contained genetic information from hundreds of thousands of people who had submitted their DNA to services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA and then uploaded their results to GED Match to find relatives. Within hours, the search returned dozens of potential genetic matches. None were close enough to be the Golden State Killer himself, but they were distant relatives, third and fourth cousins who shared small segments of DNA with the perpetrator. Ravener began building family trees based on these genetic matches. She traced lineages back through multiple generations, looking for common ancestors and then forward through their descendants. The work was painstaking and required extensive research into birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and other genealogical documents. But slowly, a picture began to emerge. The genetic evidence pointed to several possible suspects. All descended from the same ancestral lines. Investigators began conducting surveillance on these individuals, collecting discarded DNA samples from trash cans, coffee cups, and other sources. One name kept appearing in their research: Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, California, just miles from where some of the East Area Rapist attacks had occurred in the 1970s. He had worked as a police officer in Exeter from 1973 to 1976, then as a sheriff's deputy in Auburn from 1976 to 1979. He was fired from the Auburn Sheriff's Department in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. The timeline was significant. DeAngelo's law enforcement career coincided almost exactly with the East Area Rapist attacks. His firing in 1979 coincided with the end of the Northern California attacks and the beginning of the Southern California murders. His knowledge of police procedures would explain how he had managed to evade capture for so long. His access to law enforcement databases would explain how he had obtained detailed information about his victims. On April 24, 2018, investigators collected a DNA sample from DeAngelo's car door handle while he was inside a Hobby Lobby store in Roseville. The DNA was a match. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had been identified. April 24, 2018, 6:15 p.m. Joseph James DeAngelo was in his front yard watering plants when Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies surrounded his home in Citrus Heights. "Put your hands where I can see them," one deputy shouted. DeAngelo looked confused, almost bewildered. This wasn't the confident predator who had terrorized California for over a decade. This was a frail, elderly man who seemed genuinely surprised by what was happening. "What's this about?" he asked, as they placed him in handcuffs. "You're under arrest for murder," came the reply. Within hours, the news had spread across the country. The Golden State Killer, one of America's most prolific serial killers, had finally been caught. But who was Joseph James DeAngelo? Born in 1945 in Bath, New York, DeAngelo had grown up in a military family. His father was a sergeant in the Army Air Forces. The family moved frequently during his childhood, living in various locations across the United States and Germany. DeAngelo graduated from high school in 1964 and briefly attended Sierra College in California before being drafted into the Navy. He served as a damage controlman on the USS Canberra during the Vietnam War. After his military service, he attended California State University, Sacramento, where he earned a degree in criminal justice. In 1973, he was hired as a police officer in Exeter, California. By all accounts, DeAngelo was an unremarkable officer. His supervisors described him as competent but not exceptional. His colleagues remember him as quiet, reserved, someone who kept to himself, but there were signs of the darkness that lay beneath the surface. In 1975, while working as a police officer in Exeter, DeAngelo was engaged to a woman named Bonnie Colwell. The engagement ended abruptly when Colwell began dating another man. According to later interviews, DeAngelo was devastated by the breakup. Friends and family members described him as becoming increasingly angry and withdrawn. Some investigators believe this rejection was the trigger that led to his first attacks as the East Area Rapist. In 1976, DeAngelo left the Exeter Police Department and joined the Auburn Sheriff's Department in Placer County. Auburn was located in the heart of the area where the East Area Rapist attacks were occurring. As a sheriff's deputy, DeAngelo would have had access to police reports, crime scene information, and victim details. He would have known how investigations were conducted and what evidence investigators were looking for. He also would have known the neighborhoods where he was attacking people. Many of the East Area Rapist crimes occurred in areas that were part of DeAngelo's patrol beat. In 1973, DeAngelo married Sharon Marie Hubble, a law student. They had 3 daughters together and appeared to be a normal suburban family. Neighbors described DeAngelo as quiet but helpful. He would shovel snow from elderly neighbors' driveways. He helped with community events. He coached youth baseball. But there were also signs of a darker side. Neighbors reported that DeAngelo had a violent temper. They heard him screaming at family members. One neighbor witnessed him throwing furniture around his garage during what appeared to be a rage episode. DeAngelo was also known to be obsessive about his property. He would spend hours working in his yard, always at night. Neighbors would see him prowling around his property with a flashlight, checking for signs of intrusion. Perhaps most disturbing of all, several neighbors reported seeing DeAngelo peering through their windows or standing in their yards late at night. When confronted, he would claim to be looking for his lost cat or checking for prowlers. The same behavior he exhibited as the Golden State Killer, the prowling, the window peeping, the obsessive surveillance, was happening in his own neighborhood. After his firing from the Auburn Sheriff's Department in 1979, DeAngelo worked a series of jobs in the private sector. He was employed by a trucking company, worked in construction, and eventually landed a job as a mechanic for a grocery store chain. The job with the grocery store chain was significant because it required him to travel throughout California, servicing equipment at various store locations. This travel coincided with the original Night Stalker attacks in Southern California. DeAngelo worked at the grocery chain until his retirement in 2017, just months before his arrest. Throughout his post-law enforcement career, DeAngelo maintained the appearance of a normal suburban retiree. He attended family gatherings. He went to his daughter's sporting events. He took vacations with his wife. But investigators now believe he was also continuing to commit crimes. Although he was only charged with crimes committed before 1986, investigators suspect DeAngelo may have been responsible for additional attacks throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Several unsolved cases in California bear similarities to Golden State Killer attacks, but statute of limitations issues and lack of conclusive evidence have prevented additional charges. The man who had terrorized California for over a decade had been hiding in plain sight for more than 40 years. June 29th, Joseph James DeAngelo sat in a Sacramento courtroom, flanked by his attorneys. At 74 years old, he was a shadow of the predator who had once terrorized California. The hearing was unlike any other in criminal justice history. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, many victims and family members participated via video conference, but their impact was no less powerful. One by one, they told their stories. The survivors spoke of decades of fear, of lives forever changed by a few hours of terror. Family members of victims spoke of loved ones lost, of questions that would never be answered. "You destroyed my life," one survivor told DeAngelo directly. "But I survived. I'm still here. And you're finally where you belong." DeAngelo showed little emotion during most of the proceedings. He sat quietly, occasionally responding to questions from the judge with simple yes or no answers. But when victim impact statements began, something changed. For the first time in over 40 years, Joseph James DeAngelo was forced to confront the human cost of his crimes. As part of a plea agreement, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of additional crimes. In exchange, he avoided the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "The defendant deserves no mercy," Superior Court Judge Michael Bowman said during sentencing. "He has exhibited no remorse or empathy for his victims. He deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison." The Golden State Killer case had finally come to an end. But the impact of the case extends far beyond the conviction of Joseph James DeAngelo. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo has revolutionized criminal investigations. Hundreds of cold cases have now been solved using similar techniques. The technology that helped catch the Golden State Killer is helping bring justice to families who had given up hope decades ago. The case also highlighted the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes. Investigators like Paul Holes and advocates like Michelle McNamara proved that cold cases can still be solved, even decades after they occur. Most importantly, the case gave a voice to the survivors and victims' families who had waited more than 40 years for justice. Joseph James DeAngelo is now serving his sentence at California State Prison, Cocoyan. He spends 23 hours a day in his cell and is allowed 1 hour of recreation time alone in a small yard. He will never be released. He will never hurt anyone again. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror is finally over. The story of the Golden State Killer is one of terror and tragedy, but it's also one of perseverance and justice. For more than 40 years, investigators, advocates, and family members refused to give up. They knew that somewhere out there, a monster was living freely while his victims continued to suffer. But they also knew that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. Joseph James DeAngelo thought he had gotten away with it. For decades, he lived a normal life while his victims lived with the trauma he had inflicted. He attended family barbecues while families of his murder victims gathered at gravesites. He slept peacefully while his surviving victims struggled with nightmares. But justice has a long memory, and thanks to advances in technology, the dedication of investigators and the courage of survivors, that justice finally prevailed. The Golden State Killer case reminds us that no matter how much time passes, no matter how cold a case becomes, there are people who will never stop fighting for the truth. And sometimes that's enough. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth examination of the Golden State Killer case. These stories aren't easy to tell, and they're not easy to hear, but they're important. They remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of justice to prevail, even against impossible odds. If you found this investigation valuable, please take a moment to subscribe to Crime Vault. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue bringing you these detailed investigations with the respect and thoroughness they deserve. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe these stories matter. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget that the truth always finds a way to surface. This has been Crime Vault. Thank you for listening.